I mean, what a gift to be able to come together and to utilize this medium for that way. I'm going to introduce myself. So, Anim Bojo, Shungilawakan, Indigenous Nea Shinigiming and Dunjapa, Wabazishi and Dodem, Abitang, Kasupsim Lekwungen. My English name is Russell Johnston, and I have the privilege of being the Indigenous Education Manager here at Royal Roads. One of the many privileges that I have for being a member of the Royal Roads community is the opportunity to meet people like Butch and spend time with people like Butch and the members of our Heron People's Circle. I'm always grateful for every opportunity that I get to spend time with Butch, and I always walk away from those spaces, with the hamster on the wheel, thinking about, all those things that Butch chooses to pass along in his stories and in our interactions. And so it's always an absolute pleasure to be here. I guess this is our second time doing this conference and being a part of the communication family, which we're grateful for. The opportunity to be here and to chat, and of course the people in the room. We don't get this chance to do this without all of you seeing value in it and joining us. So Butch and I are going to chat, and we're going to open it up for questions sort of along the way. We'll probably ask them to save your questions maybe to the end. Butch and I will chat for a little bit, and then we'll create some space for some questions. What I know of Butch, there's not much that's usually out of bounds. We'll try to answer those as best as we can. And so I guess just want to extend a chimigwech for this opportunity to be here. So Butch, I guess my first sort of question for you is, why do we do a welcome? Why do you introduce yourself in your language? What's said in that space, and why do we start that one?
I think that's been a question that's been asked all across, the Victoria area and surrounding areas, and as far as I guess, the traditional welcome to our lands. And some of the things that kind of exemplify that is the tribal journeys that we have on the coast, where canoes travel up and down, not only Vancouver Island, but the mainland and the United States. And it's very important, to ask permission to enter the territory. And if you're going to use any of the resources on the territory, then you must ask in a humble way. And usually it's tied to some form of gift that's an exchange between nations. And this is not a new thing. This started a long, long time ago when people used to travel to this land to harvest some of our box of treasures, which is coho salmon and the herring. And people used to travel to this land to not only harvest herring, but also to set up camp and to dry the herring or smoke the herring. So that kind of led to the name Lekwungen, which means the land of smoked herring. And Lekwung, of course, is the language that we use in this area. And just a brief mention of the land, or if the language, Lekwungen, it has been a sleeping dialect, but because, about 5 years ago, the Songhees Nation started a program to revitalize Lekwungen. And before then, there was only one elder that spoke and understood the dialect. And it's increasing every day because, the young people are becoming more aware, of who they are and where they come from and why they should represent the nation.
Yeah, I'm thankful for you bringing up the language aspect of things and what that means, certainly from a Lekwungen perspective. I mean, I know I can only speak to it from my own Anishinaabe background and I guess Lakota teachings and some words that have been passed to me down in ceremony and in those spaces too. So why is the language so important? Why are we seeing our elders and our old ones put a heavy value on making sure that those sleeping or re-nourishing languages are giving space in as many places as possible.
Yeah, I think, you know, in our teachings, you know, and we call them teachings, you know, they're what the elders passed down to us. And that's attached to the language, and the language is attached to the land. So also, you know, just about every teaching is tied to the earth, or to the land, or to the environment. And we always say that your very first breath as a Lekwungen person is that's who you are. And that holds a great deal of responsibilities to that. You know, you have to learn, and it's not yours, but you have to pass it down to a young person. And whatever you know about the culture has to be passed down to a younger person, specifically your family or immediate family.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think of my own journey. My home community, Nuu'cha'nulth, is in southern Ontario, I guess on the Bruce Peninsula. And I come from a family of residential school survivors. And because of that experience, our language was never passed down to us. My grandmother is a fluent Anishinaabe speaker. She's one of few that are left in our home community. But because of the residual effects of residential school, she never passed that language down to me. So much so that I remember the first day ever hearing her speak our language. She had picked up the phone. We used to sit at the kitchen table, and one of the things I was always grateful for was my grandma would make me bacon and eggs and breakfast every morning, and then we just sit and we just chat at the kitchen table. And so when I'd spend some time there in the summers, I remember one morning the phone rang, and she got up and she answered the phone, and she's like, "Anim Bojo," and I just sat there. I was flummoxed. I couldn't believe it. My jaw dropped, and I just listened to her talk for 10 minutes in our language, and her whole self transformed. This belly laugh, this, you know, open joy. You could see just this smile on her face. And she hung up, she said goodbye, and I was so surprised. I was like, "Well, Grandma, what you speaking? Like, what were you speaking? I had so many questions." And she's like, "Well, that was your aunt. We're talking about how we're going to do some catering and some cooking for the community center tonight. We're just going over things that we needed, and, you know, all of this kind of stuff." And I remember just being so surprised. And then, you know, as I got older, I started to understand the reasons why those things were never sort of passed down to me. And I think of, you've mentioned a couple things, and maybe that one that really strikes me right now is responsibility, right? That I carry a responsibility as an Anishinaabe person to take on that work of reseeding and re-nourishing our language. And our community, and much like I'm sure the Lekwungen language, is that sort of translation to English, right? Nuu'cha'nulth is my home community. And when I asked my grandma about it, I was like, "What does it mean?" And she's like, "Well, I guess it kind of means like a harbor." And I was like, "Kind of means?" She's like, "Well, it's a little more complicated than that." She's like, "If you're to really think about breaking it down, it's a body of, like a piece of land surrounded by water on 3 sides." And I'm like, "Okay." And so we got thinking about just the way those words are made and how it creates a different way of seeing and being and looking at the world. And I think this is where I struggle sometimes, is using the English language to try to define or to make sense of that outside world, when some of those teachings that are passed along in those spaces doesn't necessarily fit that sort of English syntax or dialogue. I'm wondering if it's the same sort of thing for your words and your teachings in the Lekwungen language.
Yeah, some of the things that I'm constantly asked is, you know, what do our names mean, and what does different words in the language mean? And And also, you know, in Victoria, you know, people want to rename places, you know, such as schools and streets and that sort of thing. But, you know, it's a translation, some kind of defy English language, you know, as you said. And I too, you know, I'm a residential school survivor. I spent my first 2 grades in residential school. And after that, you know, I went to Indian day school. And of course, you know, we weren't allowed to speak the language in residential school or in Indian day school. But my mother also said that you know, you're going to have to live in an English world, so you have to learn their language. And I started studying our language, which is Lekwungen, later on in my years. And as you know, it's harder for an adult to learn language than it is for a young person. And what you mentioned as far as, you know, the sitting around the kitchen table, that's where the language starts. You know, and I, in the summertime, because I was the youngest one in our family, I was sent down to live with my grandma or my great grandma. And great grandma didn't speak a word of English. So it was like kind of guessing game for me. So she would ask me for certain things, and I would just guess what she wanted. She either wanted water or wanted me to get more wood or to get out of the house and go play. But, you know, I did. And through repetition, you know, I gradually started to understand things she was saying. And also when, you know, when we went to the big house to a celebration, it's all about repetition in the longhouse. So you gradually catch on to different words because they're repeated over and over again. And you realize later on in life, you know, that's what they're saying. And somehow you know it's going to happen because, you know, they've mentioned that. So within the Victoria area, within I guess a 50-mile radius, there's Lekwungen, Xw'chalth'lap, which is a Saanich, and in Couch and the Xw'chalth'lap. And in Beecher Bay, which is about 18 miles out of town, they speak Xw'chalth'lap, which is actually from the United States. So I guess they came to this land to live in that area called Beecher Bay, Nuu'cha'nulth, and just remained there. So, you know, that's, I guess, you know, there's similarities between Lekwungen and Xw'chalth'lap, so much so that you can just about understand, you know, there's very, very subtle differences.
It has me thinking back home. Our Anishinaabe, traditional Anishinaabe territories are vast. You know, that very much sort of northernish, sort of Great Lakes kind of above into Quebec, into Manitoba, Minnesota, you know, all of those languages. That's just roughly. Sorry, it's funny because you have me thinking about borders now, right? This idea that, you know, they came from the USA. It's like, well, actually, they were there probably long before the USA was ever a thing, right? And so what we're seeing is that relationship to those lands, you know, that existed long before there was any you know, fake line across any lands or spaces. So I'm smiling at that. But it has me thinking about our own dialects, right? Because of the vast territory that we traditionally lived in, that we see many dialects, even just across Georgian Bay or up north in Manitoulin Island, those kinds of things. And so you're right, there's like, I see the similarities in there. We're close, but there's still those differences that exist in those spaces and in those things. I wanted to ask you about this idea of repetition. Sorry, I always smile. I can't help but smile when we spend time together because it has me thinking about how similar, even though we're from different parts of Turtle Island, and I know you don't use that term out here on the coast, but how similar our experiences are, even though we're so far away. It has me thinking about, you know, when I was speaking with my grandma about the language and how she was like, you know, I struggle writing it. Like, I asked her, she's like, I have a hard time putting like literal letters to them because, as you mentioned, right, we were always an oral um, way of transferring knowledge from generation to generation. And so when they started putting language things together with my grandma, she's like, I don't know how to write these. Like, that's not how we learn. We learned by being on the land. We learned by sitting at the kitchen table. We learned by doing the things around, and we slowly were able to process through that sort of lived experience as opposed to reading something, right? It was all about that lived sort of thing. So I guess this is leading me to this next question, which is, you mentioned repetition and how those things are repeated and what a valuable tool that is. Are you noticing with these next generations that are coming that are maybe more influenced by technology and social media and these kinds of things, this idea of sort of almost instant gratification, this instant, like, I need to know this right away. I need, like, oh, I'll just Google that and find this out. And all of a sudden, the relationship to those teachings or knowledge, even in itself, do you see that there's a shifting, or do you think there's a shifting because of that change?
Yeah, I think there's a huge shift, Russ, and sometimes it's with regard to, I guess, formal programs that are presented at places such as University of Victoria, where they have a very large language program, but they teach in a different way. And regardless of what you say, the language is going to change by what they're trying to teach. And some of it has to do with grammar, where a lot of our sentences and words are backwards, just as French. But they break it down so much that it becomes very complicated. And it's no longer at the kitchen table, but it's in a classroom, and you're learning a formal way of teaching. So it's not the case of an elder standing in front of the room sort of saying, repeat after me, but it, even that is different. It's I asked my sister once, about, she's fluent in two dialects, and I asked her, well, how can we teach the language? And she said, well, just like we are now, because we were sitting at a kitchen table. And she pointed at the table, named the table, and the salt and the pepper, and what we were doing as far as talking. So that's, I think that in my way, that's kind of a danger to our culture, because if you change that, then you're kind of buying into other programs where you have to have a degree to teach your language. And I'm not saying that is wrong, because a lot of young people have done that, but they eventually gravitate to conversational language, which is, I always encourage people to learn conversational language before, they go up to UVic and start studying that program. And you're right, technology is affecting every area of our lives. And sometimes it's like that big wave that, we can't stop it, because the young people, that's the way they communicate. And the first thing that they said in our nation was that, let's put it on a computer. And then people at their own time can log in and study the language. And I find that very difficult, even though I have logged in and tried to understand. It's just so different, to me, than the way I was brought up. So that, that repetition, you can just press repeat on your computer and press it, but you may be learning the wrong way.
No, and you bring up a lot of things that we're thinking about, I guess, when I think of being in those educational spaces, right? And maybe back to that thing you had mentioned earlier around responsibility for being able to make sure that these next generations have access to those things, and what do those things look like as we're shifting and transforming to new things, new technologies, new ways of thinking about what our relationship is to knowledge. And I guess that's one that I've really been thinking about quite a bit here in academia and here at Royal Roads, right? Is what is our relationship to knowledge, and what does it mean to be ethical in the way that we communicate our knowledge systems. I'm curious for you, what is it about relationships that's so important when we think of our communities, our relationships to our language, our knowledge, our teachings? Why are relationships so important?
I think, as people, we rely on relationships and with other people, and past 2 years have really taught us, how much other people mean to us. And when we finally do see, our family, then it's going to be a very exciting and a happy day. But when you look at ethical, it's you have to break down each word, because it's like an English speaker trying to break down our language and saying, what did they say? And they have to go look at a book and say, this is what they said. And I actually brought that up at one of our Heron people meetings, is that the language that academics use confuses me. Even the buzzwords such as reconciliation, decolonization, indigenization, what does that all mean to an elder? Because, most of the time they don't even understand, what the academic people are talking about. So it's like they're talking in a different language. And I can register those words in my head and then rush home and look at my dictionary and say, oh, that's what they're saying. And then I begin to understand it. But I said, well, why don't they just say those things instead of using those fancy words? And that's very true with a lot of elders. We could sit there and nod our heads, and we don't even know what our nodding our heads to. So we talked a long time ago about, you and I, Russ, just talk. That's what we like. That's what we thrive on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think of the time that I get to spend with you and the Heron people, and the things that you choose to share in those spaces, right? You all are very conscious of the stories that you're sharing, why you're sharing them. I'm smiling. We mentioned repetition before. I've heard the same story a couple times in those spaces, but I know there's a reason for it, right? I know that idea of repetition is important because there's something there that we as a community are not receiving in the gift that you're giving with what you choose to share in those spaces. And I smile sometimes in our meetings because I'm thinking, you have this idea that you're not totally interpreting what it is that they're saying, but I'm smiling because I think a lot of times they're not interpreting the knowledge that you're sharing. And so, you're looking at it as you don't have the tools to be able to hear what they're saying, but I see a lot of times in those spaces, they also don't have the tools to fully translate what it is that you're sharing in those spaces too. So it becomes this really sort of interesting space to try to navigate. Because I think of, some of the meetings that we've had and the important stories that have been shared and the teachings that go into, what's shared by, Shirley or Victor or, yourself in those things. And it's ripe with teachings and knowledge and all these kinds of things. But what I see is this maybe inability to translate exactly what it is in that you're choosing to share at that sort of moment. So I'm smiling as somebody who tries to do their best to manage, though that's sort of an ethical space in between. And so I think it goes both ways, I guess is really what I'm getting at, is that we have a responsibility as a community to understand our relationship to Indigenous knowledge and to the teachings of these lands and these territories. And we have a responsibility to put the work in and to understand why we speak about these things in the way that we do, why we share stories in the way that we do, why we're put a heavy influence on oral transmission and these kinds of things. So I always think of that relationship as this reciprocity, right? It's, you know, how are we making sure that we balance those ideas and those concepts out, because it goes both ways, right? I mean, I think that's the ethical piece of communication that we can talk about is the reciprocity that must occur in that relationship to be. I know that we do have a short timeline, as that's how these things work, as I'm sure you know. And so I was wondering if anybody wanted to put some questions in the chat, if there's anything in there that, you know, we could address. I know that there's something from Shelley Doyle, so I'll read it out, Butch. My partner is a proud Welshman, and I see many similarities towards the treatment of language in Wales and the native languages here in Canada. His grandparents would get the cane at school if they were heard to speak Welsh. The language is now coming back in a big way in Wales. My daughter attended a Welsh language school for 18 months before coming to Canada, and the two of them enjoy having a secret language when we are out and about here. There is still a big debate about the value of the Welsh language, but I resonated with what you said, Russ, about it giving you another way of seeing. Language is another lens to view life from and changes our experience of life. So I guess my question for you, Butch, and that is, do you feel that because the Lekwungen language is rooted in these lands, that it gives a different way of seeing and being in relation to the world?
I think lately we've been talking, Russ, about, you know, climate change in the environment and its appreciation of life in general, and that means all living life, you know, and that's the way we were brought up, and we know, you know, because of the cultural climate change, that, you know, all our ways of believing and seeing and doing didn't exist anymore, because, you know, the resources were no longer there. So I think it's vitally important, you know, that to hold on to each part of language that you can. And it doesn't matter, you know, what culture you're from or what part of the earth you are from. I think I always appreciate, you know, hearing, you know, Asian families communicating with each other and South Asian families communicating in their language. You know, I think, you know, that's like a blessing to their family that they can communicate in their language. But you realize, you know, what's behind that is that they've been taught ever since they're very young. And we had a lot of that taken away from us, you know, and because of, I guess, you know, residential schools is probably the biggest example, you know, so, but that's no longer so, you know, that we need to, I guess somebody mentioned sustainability, and we have to look at that not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of the culture and the language, and try not to let technology take over, because, you know, the things that happened in our longhouse were meant to be taught through repetition. And the very first time I went into the longhouse, I was allowed into the longhouse, you know, I was told to sit and listen. And I was also taught that, you know, there are things that young people should do. And way back then, you know, we used to pass a pail of water and give each elder a drink of the water. And there were sticks that we used to drum on a bench. So it was our duty to pass those along to the elders, and also to collect them. So there was responsibilities to, you know, what we were given. And we look at that as, you know, that because of repetition, we say, well, this is what I have to do. And there's another step, so that when you get your First Nation name, then you start that big step into the culture. and you try to remember as best you can as a young person what happened and what was said and what you were given and the responsibilities behind that.
It has me thinking of, I guess, our own ceremonies, and I guess what I always appreciate about them is there's a reason we have them, right? There's a reason that they've nourished our peoples since time immemorial, right? There's a reason that there's certain protocols that exist in those places. There's a certain reason that we do them, so that we can be, as we say in our language, Minogomadzwin, to live the good life or to be the good life, to be the best versions of ourselves. And these are tried and tested ways of developing our knowledge systems and our understanding of the world and who we are and what our place is within them. A very close colleague of mine, Harold Johnston, passed away recently after a battle with cancer. He's an author. He's written some books. There's quite a few of them, so I won't bother sort of naming them all. But he did an interview with Sheila Rogers before he passed. And in that interview, he mentioned how important it was to listen and to sit and to think and to process and to take the time to just be present and gift that idea of just listening. Do you feel that when we speak about communications that perhaps, what role does listening play in an ethical sort of communication sort of standpoint? Do we put enough emphasis on listening?
Yeah, we quite often think about that, and sometimes you listen in certain ways, and that's based on your history, your family history, and things that have been said before then. You sort of listen in that sort of way, and people who form opinions whilst they're listening are probably usually people that have an agenda. And Russ, you know how I feel about agendas, which is not really big. You know, I think we talked a long time ago about throwing the agendas away and just talking, and just people sitting in at the kitchen table or a big circle and having the opportunity to actually speak and have people really listen, which is listening is really, you know, as a teenager, I didn't listen very well probably. And some of my school days, you know, I probably didn't listen properly either, because as an artist, you know, I prefer to be doodling rather than listening. So listening, you know, covers all those areas. You know, it's you know, you can say, well, empty your mind and don't think anything else about, and let, you know, listen to the person that's speaking to you, and as they speak, you know, try listen properly and not form opinions or saying this is right or this is wrong or this is not me, or, you know, all those other things that come about, which is really a big task for people, you know, because in today's world, it's even become a bigger task, you know, when all these other things are going on in the world that we don't really understand. And when you kind of form opinions, you know, about all kinds of things, but you know, opinions are something that maybe sometimes should be just hidden away in your head somewhere and not expressed, you know, because, you know, they can become, you know, anger in a very little while, or misunderstanding or misinterpretation.
Has me thinking of respect, right? You know, how much of listening shows respect, right? And I guess, you know, another thing, yeah, as always, I'm smiling when you choose to share what you do, but listening as a skill, right? As something that needs to be trained and needs to be nourished as we go through our journeys here on this realm and in these places. But it's a skill, right? It's something that needs to be, as you mentioned, practiced and takes practice. And I think that's always something that I think about sort of every day, right? How can I be better? Where do I have places for growth? And I think of that one often is my own relationship with listening and all of those things that you mentioned through your own sharing. So we have two more comments in the chat. So I'll read the first one. This one's from Shasha. I think of academic language as a form of classism, not only within their professional ranks, but also to develop a wall between outward society, white collar and blue collar. So I guess when I think of that one, right, is the importance of relevance, speaking to those that are in the room, right, honoring that relationship that exists. There's one last sort of comment that I'm curious to get your thoughts before we have to sort of sign off here and give people a chance to get to the next meeting at 10 o'clock. This one comes from John Price. So thoughts on land acknowledgements. Should the government's standard format be used, or is there a way to be more respectful? When we acknowledge unceded territory, it seems a bit different than saying traditional land, with the former implying we really should be looking to cede back the land, which is a pretty weighty concern to say and then ignore for the rest of a session. What are your thoughts on land acknowledgements, Butch?
Oh gosh, I'm called on so many times during the week to do land acknowledgements. And at one time I expressed that I feel like an elder in a closet where they drag me out and say, do the land acknowledgement, and then I do that, and then I'm gone again. So it's, that, and you realize, that they're doing that out of respect. And a lot of times, they show gratitude for you doing that. But you wonder, about impact in terms of, say I'm asked to go to the legislator, which I'm quite often asked to do, and to do a welcome. And usually I sing a song and I do the typical land acknowledgement. And sometimes, I sneak in a few comments about government if I can slide that there. And I guess coming up on the 5th of March, I guess I'm going to Government House to do a traditional welcome, and I'm going to drum the people in that are going to receive awards. And you appreciate that. And because, the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia has studied Xw'chalth'lap, and she's becoming quite fluent. And she's also looks at the practices that we do. And I noticed the other day when she was walking through the house that she lifted up her hands in gratitude, thanking everybody for being there. So, those small steps mean a lot, to us. And I guess the typical welcome is something that's been done in schools all across District 61 and District 62, which is Victoria and Souk. And again, that's appreciated, because that's one step closer. In District 62, they have 2 schools that have Coast Salish names. And they're just now making moves to, I guess, to rename streets in Victoria with typical Lekwungen names. So all those are small steps, but I guess there's always the fear that this becomes something that, again, repetition. Oh, we're doing this because. But, the actually recognizing the lands of the Lekwungen people and understanding, how that came to be.
Yeah, no, it's, I think of those things quite often. I think, maybe what I'm taking from John's comment is this idea that it's somehow we stop, right? That, in our teachings and the things that have been passed down to us is that we're constantly learning, we're constantly growing, and we'll constantly learn and we'll constantly grow until we take our last breath in these spaces. It's that humility of, we're building every single day upon what we've learned from the day before. It's not static, it doesn't stop, right? Like it doesn't end, that we're constantly going to be learning and growing together as we move through these spaces. And it's something that I think about sort of constantly of how can I be better, and knowing that I'll constantly be growing and learning more every single day. And so maybe to John's point, it doesn't stop. it's a continual growth. It's a relationship. This thing, you know, knowledge is alive. It has a spirit, right? And we need to treat it as such as we think about land acknowledgements in any form of knowledge, that it will always keep growing and evolving and shifting and changing too. I know we're running out of time. There's one last sort of piece here. As a non-Indigenous person who has grown up in Western Canada, I feel a great love and belonging to this place. I live in View Royal near Ditidaht Lake now. What is my responsibility to place? How do I show my respect without imposing myself on others? What actions could individuals take?
Yeah, actually, I guess, you know, Songhees, which is the land that we live on, is very close to View Royal. And that area, so I'm very familiar with that area. And that's a question that's asked quite often. But they've already started. You know, they recognize that fact, that they're on Lekwungen land. You know, and it's not a matter of riding around your car saying, you know, I'm on Lekwungen land. So, you know, it's just the idea that they understand as a person where they are and where they live, work, and play. And which is very important. You know, they and if they traveled 18 miles towards Sydney, I guess, you know, they'd be on Sanders territories. That doesn't mean as you drive over that little boundary that you have to start recognizing Sanders land. You know, it's I appreciate, you know, the way they've expressed themselves, and you know, we're taught always to show gratitude. And I went to a home the other weekend, and the person came out and he was speaking Xw'chalth'lap, because, you know, he had friends that were from Xw'chalth'lap and he learned the language. So he greeted me in Xw'chalth'lap, which kind of took me aback. And then I raised up my hands to him and I said, oh, thank you. You know, I really appreciate that. And that doesn't mean that, you know, that everyone needs to do that. And, but, you know, those little steps, they count, you know, just as an infant when they make their first step. And when you make that first step, that's the very start of learning.
It's beautiful. As always, when I sit in spaces with you, Butch, I think of how much gratitude I have for what you choose to share with us in this space. I know that I'm going to go for a walk later today and do my best to digest many of the things that you've passed along to us. And so, Miigwech, for your time today. And thank you to everybody in the room who joined us in this conversation. I know that there's some other things going on at 10 o'clock today, but always grateful for the opportunity to sit with you and to have others with us. I'm really thankful. And so any last words, Butch, before we sign off for the day?
Yeah, it's been good, you know, that we've had a good talk today. You know, that's important, Russ. And we have a lot of good conversations and solve all the problems of the world, I know, in our conversations. But I enjoy, you know, I wish, you know, I could meet everyone that's here this morning. You know, there's a lot of ways we can acknowledge First Nation people and follow all the steps of reconciliation. But, you know, it's going to take time. And we need patience and a lot of gratitude. So thank you very much for sharing your time today. And would we say, you know, Haishkasiamsiea Hayakwa, which means see you later. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day, everybody. It's
Thank
been an
you.
honor.
Thank you both for being here and such, like, could listen to your conversation. I feel like it would be so nice to have an actual cup of coffee with you both and just continue the conversation. So thank you so much for letting us share that with you. And we'll close this session now, and we'll invite whoever wants to come back for the 10 o'clock start, which is in 5 minutes, which will be with Lauren Holcomb-Smith and Ken Jeffrey, and it's entitled Ethics in Learning Design and Instructors Designers Conscience. So thank you again to Elder Butch and to you, Russ, and thank you for everyone else who've been here. It was a fantastic session, and we'll see you all hopefully soon. And please stay safe and take care of yourself and your families.
Thank you.